Do we know what causes dementia and Alzheimer's yet? Do we have any ideas? Because when they do the brain imaging, they can kind of see these plaques on the brain, they say. But
I mean, there's a lot of different, it's multifactorial, which means there's a lot of different causes of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So I would say you mentioned plaques, amyloid beta plaques. What happens is, that's the aggregation of a protein in our brain called amyloid that typically is cleared from our brain. And what happens is this abnormal, thing happens where you're not clearing the amyloid. And so it starts to kind of form these clumps and aggregates with the amyloid proteins that are not being cleared. And that essentially is happening outside of your neurons, but it's happening where the synapses are formed between neurons. And so what happens is it kind of disrupts the synaptic connection between neurons, which is essentially forming a memory. And so when you start to disrupt that connection, you lose not only the memories start to go away, but the whole purpose of the neuron is to one of the purposes is to form a memory. And so you start to neurons start to die, right, when they start to lose their purpose. Amyloid aggregation is linked to a lot of things. So, for example, I mentioned it being cleared. When we sleep, particularly when we're in our deep sleep stage, slow wave sleep, that is something happens that's kind of incredible. It's called activation of the glymphatic system. So you've heard of the lymphatic system. Well, the glymphatic system is essentially this series of networks and almost like these highways and essentially roads and stuff all throughout the brain, where you're squirting this cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain, and it's clearing away all the garbage, things like proteins that didn't get cleared, and it's sort of squirting them out and clearing them out through this glymphatic system. That glymphatic system is activated during sleep, and it's one of the reasons why people that don't get good sleep over the course of decades have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, is because they're getting these amyloid plaques built up in their brains. But there's other causes as well. So, for example, glucose metabolism is disrupted in the brains of Alzheimer's disease. You need glucose. Your neurons need glucose. And so, essentially, your brain isn't able to make energy correctly without the glucose getting into your brain. And so that's another sort of metabolic underlying cause of Alzheimer's disease, where you're essentially, it's thought to be where you're eating a lot of refined carbohydrates, refined sugars, and you're not exercising, and essentially you're disrupting the glucose metabolism in the brain as well as the whole body, right? So the brain and body are connected. But there's also genetic causes as well, and some people have genes that can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease because they're not able to clear amyloid as well, because they're not able to repair damage as well. So the blood-brain barrier, which is really important for filtering out toxic things from getting into the brain, it starts to break down. And that's one of the, I would say, early signs of Alzheimer's disease, is that breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. And that happens in people that have a genetic risk factor called ApoE4. You may have heard of this, but this is probably one of the biggest genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. About 25% of the population has one copy of this gene. That increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by twofold. If you have two copies of it, it increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by tenfold.
So twofold being 200%?
Twofold being twice as much. Yeah, 200%. And tenfold being 1,000%, right? You're basically almost, it's pretty bad. And it's not it's not your destiny to get the Alzheimer's disease if you have those genes. You can do things in your lifestyle that can sort of turn the table. So you're not essentially going to be getting that Alzheimer's disease, and a lot of different lifestyle factors like getting good sleep, like exercising, avoiding alcohol, avoiding smoking, not being overweight and obese. Those affect your Alzheimer's disease risk. More importantly, if you have one of those genes, then you really have to be cognizant of those things, because if you have one of those, ApoE4 genes, then essentially your lifestyle matters even more than people that don't.
And you can do a test to figure out if you have those genes?
Yes. There's a variety of genetic testing services that can be done. Pretty much all the ones that are out there on the market, Ancestry DNA. Depending on where you live and there's so many out there right now that will test for that.
Mortified if I found out I had two of those genes.
Two of them is less common. When I mentioned the 25% of the population having it, it's usually one allele. Alcohol essentially can really increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease if you have one of those genes. And I think that there's really no safe amount of alcohol that can be consumed for people that have ApoE4 if you're concerned about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. The other thing is contact sports and traumatic brain injury. People that have any of the, any one or two of the ApoE4 genes, if they have that, then if they get a TBI, like if they're playing American football or they're playing soccer or MMA or boxing, whatever, then you talk about like going up to a tenfold risk for Alzheimer's disease when you get like an injury, because people with those genes don't repair damage as well. And so it affects their brain's ability to repair damage. And so that's also really important to consider.
So moving back then to the simple things that we can do to improve our cognitive performance as we age, the things that are simpler than doing the vigorous HIIT training.
There's actually quite a few. And first and foremost, the one I love the most is a simple multivitamin. And the reason I love this is because, I don't know, it was about 10 years ago, there was a huge study that was published. And it was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and it was called Enough is Enough. Multivitamins are not only useless, they're harmful. And it was essentially looking at a variety of studies and arguing that multivitamins are expensive urine. You're just not really doing anything. And in fact, if you take a multivitamin, you might even be increasing the risk of disease. That study was terrible. And I, 10 years ago, went and just broke it down and, pulled it apart piece by piece. But here we are 10 years later. 3 large clinical trials have been done. These are randomized controlled trials where older adults were given either a multivitamin, and this was just your standard run-of-the-mill multivitamin, Centrum Silver, or they were given a placebo. And they were given this for a couple of years. And what 3 different studies showed was that a multivitamin improved cognition, improved processing speed, it improved what's called episodic memory. So the kind of memory where you're remembering experiences and you can recall events, things like that. And not only did it improve it improved it so much that it was equivalent to reducing the aging of the episodic memory by 5 years. So a simple multivitamin. And why is that important? Because, multivitamins have a variety of these vitamins and minerals that we're not getting from our diet that are important for everything. For metabolism, for the way our neurotransmitters are firing, for reducing damage that's causing, oxidative stress, right? So a simple multivitamin, how much easier can it be than taking a simple multivitamin? And the fact of the matter is that we're talking about a randomized controlled trial. This is showing cause, right? This isn't just an association. This is showing that you took a multivitamin for a couple of years and it improved your cognition more than a placebo.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's pretty incredible, and it's one of the examples that I like. But diving deeper into some of the nutrients, this is an area, I started out as a scientist. I started out as a chemist, actually. But when I first got into biology, I was working in an aging lab and studying aging. It was very interesting to me because I essentially, with my own experiments, with my own 2 hands, could manipulate these like tiny little worms. They're called C. elegans, and their whole genome was sequenced at the time. And this was like in the early 2000s. And they have a lot of genes that are similar to humans. It's called homology. And one of the genes is the insulin signaling pathway and the IGF-1 pathway. So insulin signaling would be something that's activated with glucose when you're eating a lot of sugar, right? And I could take these worms and I could genetically decrease their insulin signaling. So it kind of, if you think about a parallel to that, that would be, okay, we're not going to be eating as much sugar, right? We're not going to be activating that pathway so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I could do that in this worm that has a life expectancy of about 15 days. And I could extend its life expectancy to 30 days, right? So you're increasing its life expectancy by pretty much, 100%, right? Well, not only did they, live longer, they were healthier and youthful. And you could see that visually. They're moving around and they were just youthful worms. And so I was very excited about this, in my 20s because I was like, wow, this is very relevant. we have this gene and we know lifestyle factors that affect it, right? Sugar. So the take home for me was lifestyle matters. Yeah, genetics. Maybe that'll be something one day where we're decreasing the insulin signaling. But I was looking for the now, not the future technology. And so the now to me was, wow, like I don't want to be constantly activating my, insulin signaling pathway. Like, look what happens to these worms if you reduce it. I mean, it's amazing. They're youthful and they live longer. And so I started to kind of get into diet and lifestyle, sort of just out of curiosity, and started reading in the literature. And I came across some studies from my mentor, Dr. Bruce Ames, where he was showing that not getting enough nutrients, like, for example, folate. Folate is found in dark leafy greens like kale. Folate, if you decrease folate and make someone deficient in it, it essentially causes double-stranded breaks in your DNA that essentially is like being under ionizing radiation. And that experiment was done. Like, you could take a mouse, make it like put low folate in the mouse's food, and then take another mouse and put it under an ionizing radiation machine. And the amount of double-stranded breaks in their DNA, which cause cancer, which accelerate aging, which affect every how your cells are functioning, it was the same. So it was like, wow, not having a certain nutrient in your diet was like standing under an irradiating machine, ionizing radiation. No one's going to want to stand under an ionizing radiation machine, but no one's thinking about how your diet can do the same thing. And that was kind of, I got into a lot of Bruce's research at the time. So Bruce, anyone in the science field knows Dr. Bruce Ames. He actually came up with the Ames carcinogen test. And that essentially was a way of cheaply looking at and identifying whether something's a carcinogen. And he got into sort of nutrition as he started to figure things like folate, basically lack of folate being a carcinogen, essentially, right? Like ionizing radiation is a carcinogen. And then he started to go on to other nutrients as well, like magnesium and B vitamins. But I think for me, the aha moment was micronutrients and these vitamins and minerals are affecting the way we age, are affecting our health on a similar level as these toxic things that we're worried about, like ionizing radiation. And nobody's thinking about it like that. So I'll give you an example. Vitamin D. You talked about dementia, what's going to help prevent dementia. Vitamin D it's actually more than a vitamin. Vitamin D gets converted into a steroid hormone. So a steroid hormone, essentially, what it does is it goes into the nucleus of a cell where all your DNA is, and it's activating genes and deactivating them. It's affecting your genome. And it's actually over 5% of your genome is being affected by vitamin D. Why is that important? Because 70% of the US population has insufficient levels of vitamin D. The reason for that is because vitamin D3 is actually made in the skin from UVB radiation from the sun. And so if you're not outside, then you're not really making a lot of vitamin D3 in your skin. And vitamin D3 then gets converted into this steroid hormone that regulates everything, right? And so, in modern day society, we're inside all the time. We're working. We're not outside. And even if you were outside, there's so many other factors that affect it. So anything that blocks out UVB radiation blocks out the ability of your body to make vitamin D3. So sunscreen, right? That's a big one. Melanin, the darker pigmentation that acts as a natural sunscreen. And then latitude, depending on where you live also. So, a good number of months out of the year, if you're in a more northern latitude like England, like Wales, like Chicago or Sweden, UVB radiation's not even hitting the atmosphere, for several months out of the year. Combine that with sunscreen or melanin, and you got like this disaster, right? In fact, there was a study out of the University of Chicago that looked at African Americans and Caucasians and their
Black
ability—
people and white people.
Yeah, exactly. Their ability to make vitamin D3 from UVB radiation.
From the sun, yeah.
And as I mentioned, melanin is a natural sunscreen. And, people that are, either, from African origin or South American or Southeast Asian, right? People that are closer to the equator usually have more melanin. It's an adaptation to prevent you from burning from the UV rays of the sun. Well, this University of Chicago study found that people that are African American had to stay in the sun 6 to 10 times longer than people with fair skin, the Caucasians, to make the same amount of vitamin D3. And so as a consequence, if you take someone who, like yourself, well, you got a little bit more melanin.
I'm like mixed.
A little bit, yeah. You've got a little bit more melanin. But let's say you take someone who, has
like my mom. She's Nigerian.
Okay, your mom Nigerian. And let's say your mom moves to Chicago, right?
Well, she's moved to bloody England.
Or if she moved to England, right, exactly. Then you're talking about a recipe for disaster in terms of vitamin D, because you're not only not making it several months out of the year. I forgot how many months out of the year, maybe 4 or 5 or something like that, where the UVB radiation is not even hitting the atmosphere, but you have this natural sunscreen.
What's the consequences of that in terms of symptoms?
Well, it's not like an acute thing where you kind of just look in the mirror and you're like...
But what is the causation then in terms of...
Right. Yeah. So the reason I say this is because people always think of like, well, I'm not getting enough vitamin C and I have scurvy, and you can look in the mirror and your gums are falling apart, right? It's easy to identify this. Vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency is more insidious. It's kind of this damage that accumulates over time. It's something that isn't, quite noticeable, or maybe you're feeling, maybe you're feeling like lethargic, or you don't have enough energy, things like that, but you don't really know quite why. So vitamin D insufficiency and deficiency, there are acute effects where, like, if it's severe, it can cause rickets and like bone malformations and stuff, especially if it's happening early in life. But what we now know is that being deficient or insufficient in vitamin D can increase dementia risk by 80%. And that's been shown in multiple studies. The converse is also true. So people that supplement with vitamin D3, and this is where a simple solution comes in, right? So you're not making it from your skin, but you can take a supplement. People that supplement with vitamin D3 have a 40% reduced risk of dementia. So in other words, they're avoiding deficiency, which is very common, and avoiding that deficiency then is reducing their dementia risk. And there's actually even been studies in people with dementia and people with Alzheimer's disease that were giving a vitamin D supplement or a placebo control. And those individuals given the vitamin D supplement had improved cognition. They had lower markers of amyloid plaques. So those were also measured as well. So vitamin D is doing a lot of things. It's regulating 5% of your protein-coding human genome.
If I want to increase my probability of getting dementia, then I've got to stay out of the sun. I've got to avoid vitamin D. I've got to drink alcohol, smoke, be sedentary, and I've got to sleep really badly.
Yes, and eat a lot of refined sugar.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, you might go, well, how much vitamin D, right? I'm talking about deficiency and insufficiency, and you really want to get a blood test to know what your levels are. There have been, 30 plus studies that have looked at vitamin D levels and all-cause mortality. So that would be, again, how, dying from a variety of different diseases, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, cancer. And people that have blood levels of vitamin D between 40, 60, maybe 80 nanograms per milliliter have the lowest all-cause mortality. So these people are not deficient, not insufficient. Insufficiency happens at about 30 nanograms per milliliter. Below that, deficiency is 20 nanograms per milliliter and below. And so there have been a variety of studies that have looked at, for example, the brain and the aging brain and vitamin D levels. And it's been shown that for every 10 nanomole per liter decrease in vitamin D blood levels, there's an increase in brain damage. It's called white matter hyperintensities. It's basically damage to the white matter in your brain. And the white matter in your brain is myelin. That's how your brain's communicating and like how, electrical impulses are being, moved so that you can think and talk and all that. Exactly.
Yeah, I hadn't had one today, so I feel like you've persuaded me.
Most people that are deficient can increase their blood levels to a normal sufficient level by about 4,000 IUs of vitamin D per day. So that's been shown in multiple studies. It's not that hard to take. In fact, vitamin D supplements are probably the cheapest supplement out there. It's like 10 cents per pill.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.